Welcome along to In Focus. I'm Marcus Stead, and my guest today is veteran journalist, broadcaster and media trainer Graham Miller. Graham is perhaps best known as the face of Saturday night sports bulletins on the ITN News in the 1990s and early 2000s, but there's a lot more to him than that. He began his career on hospital radio, worked on BBC Radio in Birmingham and London, spent years in regional ITV, first at Anglia, then at HTV West, followed by a long spell on Thames News. And since leaving ITN, Graham has appeared as a sports newsreader on Sky News and as a reporter on Gillette Soccer Saturday, but his main focus nowadays is on his public relations and media training company. This promises to be a very interesting discussion. Well, Graham, thank you very much indeed for joining me today. I want to go back to the very beginnings of your career, first of all. And you began with hospital radio, I believe, the Hospital Relay Group, which broadcast to patients in Harpenden, Luton and Welwyn Garden City. What was your inspiration for getting involved in that? Was sports journalism something that always inspired you as a young man?
Journalism always inspired me. I don't know where it came from because there are no journalistic links at all in my family. I come from a family of medics. I was the black sheep of the family because I didn't go into medicine. In fact, my eldest son is a doctor. But I always say I would have been a doctor, but I didn't have the patience, you know. But
that's an old joke.
Yeah, I know. Well, I'm full of those. But it was lucky actually, because as a kid, you know this. I mean, we all know this. You're never quite sure what you want to do, and this, that, and the other. But from a very young age, I wanted to be a journalist. I can't give you a reason why. I just did, and that was always my focus. And I was always writing to the local papers and this, that, and the other. I fancied broadcasting as well, and there was an advert in the paper that the local hospital radio was looking for volunteers. I think actually they were looking for volunteers to raise money, you know, just to keep the station going. But I went along, and I think I talked myself into a disc jockey hour or whatever it was, and it went on from there. And I was there for a couple of years, I think. But it was great fun because you were completely on your own, literally. And I did Saturday afternoons from about 2:00 till 6:00. So goodness knows how many listeners were still listening when I finished, but it was nevertheless, from my point of view, it was a great learning ground, and I loved every second. It was great fun. Yeah, I was just very fortunate.
And was there anyone in particular during that era who sort of trained you and kept an eye on you and helped you develop?
No, I've again throughout my career, I've had very little training, which some people will not be surprised about. I've just sort of learned on the job as we go. You make a mistake, you try and make sure you don't make that mistake again, that type of thing. And I just was a very canny and careful watcher and listener of the pros. You know, how do they do it? And I thought to myself, well, would I do it that way in their circumstance? What would I say? What would I do? And I just learned by listening and watching as best I could. And then when it was my turn, fingers crossed, I hope for the best. And that's the way I did. I had some people I looked up to. I remember in my early days, I think Michael Aspel was a big hero of mine. I thought.
Well, he would have been on Capital at the time, wouldn't he? When it came to radio.
Just before. No, he was a newsreader on BBC, and of course he did Crackerjack, which is before your time.
Yeah.
That's before your time.
I'm familiar with it. Yeah.
And he did. He was the host on Miss World when that was allowed. I'm probably not even allowed to say Miss World anymore, but he hosted that for many years, and I thought that's a great job. So I watched him and followed him quite a lot, and he was one of my early heroes for sure.
Well, yeah, because Michael Aspel began his career, I think, here in Cardiff, where I live. And he was, I think, in the very early days of BBC television, they had in-vision announcers in those days on the BBC, though it was got rid of in the 1960s. And that was Michael Aspel's way in. And as you say, he went on to hosting beauty pageants, news reading in his early days as well. I mainly associate him with This Is Your Life, which he presented well into the 1990s. And but in terms of radio, it was the early days of Capital Radio, I think, where he really made a name for himself when Richard Attenborough was running Capital Radio. That's how he came through. So he was very much an inspiration for you then. But on to 1973, BBC Radio Birmingham came calling, and you were a reporter there. Who were some of your colleagues around that time?
Well, I was a student at the City of Birmingham University. I think they now call themselves Aston University. And I was a very poor student. And I was very fortunate in that. How many times have I said that already? But Pebble Mill had just opened up. Remember Pebble Mill?
Yeah,
Big
yeah.
centre in Birmingham. And local Radio Birmingham had just started. They were desperate. They were looking for anybody who had time on their hands, didn't mind they weren't going to get paid, come along and help us out. So I thought, hello, that sounds like me. So I went over there and I just started doing anything and everything. And I ended up being a reporter with my Ewer tape recorder, which was a great learning curve. And in fact, I took time off my shifts at Radio Birmingham to take my finals after 3 years. That gives you an idea of how things were. But at the time, there was Barney Bamford, I remember. He was the sort of BBC's man in Birmingham, big name at the time. Yeah. And Pebble Mill at 1 had just started. I can't remember the chap's name who did it.
Like Bob Langford, would it be?
Well, Bob came up a little bit afterwards, but that kind of era. And again, I spent a lot of time just watching and learning how they did it, because nobody said, do it this way or don't do it that way. So I just thought, well, I better watch the good guys and see what they do. But that was, again, a very great experience, because they were very good to me. They just gave me a tape recorder and said, right, off you go. And it was the time of the Birmingham bombings, you may recall. And I was reporting on this, and because I was freelance, I was paid by Radio Birmingham to do a shift, but I was also able to sell my reports to the World Service, to other broadcasters. And believe it or not, I was actually able to buy a car on the proceeds of my reports around the time of the Birmingham bombing. So it's an ill wind and all that. But I look back and I think, how on earth did they let me out? But they did. They did.
But that era, I mean, I speak to people of your generation, and there's a theme that comes up when I'm in conversation with people who are in TV and radio in that era. There was a great deal of freedom to do your own thing and learn and have a lot of fun along the way while you were learning, in a way that perhaps is not so easy to do nowadays. But I think about radio in the West Midlands in the 1970s, and my boss at Snooker Scene magazine, where I work extensively, Clive Everton, his first break in radio came at BBC Radio Birmingham round about that time. Now, Clive is, 13, 14 years older than you are. And Clive's, 82 now, and he still works full time. And he said that, well, he was well established as a print journalist by that stage, but Radio Birmingham was a way in for him in broadcast. And what he used to do is, on a Saturday afternoon, he would alternate going to Walsall matches. I mean, Clive's a big West Brom fan, but he would alternate covering Walsall matches. He would do one week, and his young understudy, a chap called Jim Rosenthal, would do the other week. And it would alternate in that way. And that was Clive's way into broadcasting. And from there, he eventually achieved his ambition of becoming a snooker commentator. The story of his first audition, getting an audition with Thames Television, that was another story. That's a comical story, actually, but I'll save that for another time. But radio in the West Midlands in that era, in terms of sport, this was the 1970s. You had strong people at the BBC, but in the commercial sector as well, you had the start of BRMB, and this was when Tony Butler was starting out as well. Tony Butler had effectively brought sports phone-in radio over from, I think he traveled around Canada and listened to how they did it. And Tony broke the mold in many ways, because then years later, probably a while after you left, the likes of Tom Ross and George Gavin all came through and all became legends of West Midlands radio. But the West Midlands in the 70s would have been a very good place to learn your trade, I imagine.
Well, it was. Tony, I remember, I think I'd left and moved on to television when he actually became this sort of iconic figure in radio. I remember him as a sub in the newsroom at BBC West for television. He was a news sub who was interested in sport, because he used to come over and we'd have a chat. But Jim Rosenthal, he was my landlord. I shared.
Really?
No, he owned a house and he couldn't pay for it, of course. So I became a tenant. And Jim and I we're friends for 40 odd years. And what was interesting at the time, because I'm a big Luton Town fan. I mean, when I was working full time, I'd never let anybody know which football team I supported. It's all changed now, but I didn't think it was right and proper. But I'm a big Luton Town fan. Yeah. And on the Birmingham Post at the time was a young reporter called Nick Owen. And to find two Luton Town fans in the middle of Birmingham was quite something. And then
he became chairman, didn't he?
He did. He left the paper and joined BBC Radio Birmingham as well. So 2 Town fans on one staff in the West Midlands was quite astonishing. But yeah, an amazing lineup when you look back.
Well, yeah, I mean, Jim Rosenthal, he started off working for Clive at Snooker Scene in the very early years of Snooker Scene. And then Clive, a little bit too ambitiously, it turned out, tried to set up Hockey Scene magazine. And he effectively made Jim the editor of that. And Hockey Scene didn't work as well as Snooker Scene did. It ended up sucking out every penny Snooker Scene ever made. But that wasn't Jim's fault by any means. And of course, Jim ended up achieving his ambitions, starting in local radio in the West Midlands, then on to LWT. And then, well, to this day, he remains one of the very best at anchoring live sports coverage, I think. But so living with Jim, that must have been good fun, though.
It was, yes. I can't. I'm not prepared to talk about some.
The reason I say this, Graham, is that there is footage on YouTube, right, of the 1983 LWT Christmas tape. Now you will remember Christmas tapes from.
I certainly do.
Yeah, and there's no way you could have imagined in those days that the internet would eventually exist and these tapes could mysteriously emerge. But I don't want to upset people who might be eating while they're listening to this, but there's footage of Jim on a trip filming in Italy, and there's outtakes of him and Ted Ayling, who ended up becoming a very senior person in the Olympic Broadcasting Service. And Jim is having a shower, and Ted decides to break into his room and go into the shower room, and we get to see a bit more of Jim than we might like to see, if you get my drift.
Yes, indeed. No, I've seen it. It's a hoot. And that gives you a good inkling, a good idea of the sort of things that we did get up to, but with a laugh and a lot of fun. And yeah, great times. Ted Ayling is a great director. Went on to become a great director.
Yeah, it's a fun video. Just look up, if those of you who've got the inclination to do it, the 1983 LWT Christmas tape. It's absolutely hilarious. But you'll see people, familiar faces, whether it's Jim, Dickie Davis, Ian St. John, in a guise who've never seen them before. It's quite something. It was intended as a joke between the ITV regions. They would send each other these outtakes just to have a laugh at Christmas. And most of the ITV regions were in on it, but this is quite something to watch. It really is. So you were at local radio in the West Midlands, and a year later, 1974, you moved to BBC Radio London. Again, that would have been, I imagine, quite a dynamic place to work. Lots of, I'm guessing, people who went on to big things were around at that time as well.
Yes, it was quite an interesting leap. I mean, that was a staff job. I was freelance at Radio Birmingham, and then suddenly I got this staff job at Radio London. I initially went down to be sports editor. But before I started on my first day, they had re-employed the sports editor, who walked out in a huff. And so my job was no longer to be sports editor, was to be one of the news reporters, which was fine. I was quite happy to do that. And I was able to cover a lot of sport in London because there was so much. But the one thing I have a striking memory, because having worked at Radio Birmingham, I was spoiled rotten because all the kit was brand new tape recorders, brand new microphones. The studios were sparkling and state of the art. I went down to Radio London, and it seemed that BBC Radio London had all the cast-offs from national radio, BBC Network Radio. And I remember reading the news, and I'm sure the last person to have used this mic must have been Alvar Liddell during the Second World War. I mean, it was that classic, with the BBC written on the middle of this huge microphone. But the oddest thing of all, again, when I look back, I mean, you've opened up memories here. Everything downstairs, as it were, was sort of up to date as it could be, and we followed, everything was up to the second. But also at that time, there was a thing called a VHF opt-out. Right. Now, Radio London was sort of medium wave, but VHF covered the whole of the southeast of England, from right down from Cornwall up to sort of Norwich. It's huge area, and it was BBC Radio London's job to cover that area with a sort of 10-minute news wrap twice a day. And if you did the early shift, which I did, you had to do it at 9 o'clock. But this was done from a studio upstairs. And I put studio in inverted commas because it was just a broom cupboard. Literally was a broom cupboard. And there was a microphone and some machinery that you had to switch yourself on and off. And the clock, it wasn't even quartz. It was an ordinary clock. And you just sort of hope for the best you're on time. And the audience must have been massive. And yet the resources that we had to do that compared to Radio London, which was a much smaller audience, was remarkable. And people used to, people would hear my voice and say, oh, yes, we hear you on radio VHF BBC VHF. It's an extraordinary misuse of resources, I would say. But again, an amazing learning experience when you're all on your own. It's up to you to switch yourself on, get yourself out. There was no way of hearing what was happening before. You just had to hope for the best. But I've forgotten all about that. You've opened up memories here, Marcus.
So were you there mainly at BBC Radio London on news rather than sport at that time?
Yes, it was mainly news. A chap called Norman de Mesquita, that was his name.
Oh, I'll tell you a story about him in a minute. Carry on.
He ran the sports desk, and I think he walked out, but then, as I say, came back again. And he loved his cricket, and there were other sports that were his sports, so he wouldn't let anybody in. And he also wrote for the Times as well. He was a very experienced and well-established journalist when I got there. So I was mainly doing news. And what happened was, one early morning, I was on the very early shift, and I noticed on the news wires, it used to come through, chug, 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 that there'd been an incident at Moorgate tube station. So this was my patch. I thought, well, I better go and find out what's going on. So I got on the tube, got to Moorgate tube station, got down to the platform, and lo and behold, I witnessed the most extraordinary thing. This tube train literally was like a concertina smashed right into the tunnel. And you may not remember, but in the end, I think around 75, 80 people were killed in the Moorgate tube crash. And I was right down on the platform, and there was soot coming off the ceiling because at the roof, because in the olden days the tubes were run by steam trains, and so it had hit it so hard. This soot was coming down from goodness knows how many years before, and eventually they saw I was there and they threw me out. I've been thrown out of lots of places since, but during that morning the death rate was extraordinary. It was sort of 5 dead, 10 dead, 15 dead. And here's the thing, actually, I rang, because I was local radio, I rang the BBC Radio 4 news desk and said, look, I'm at Moorgate tube station and I'm witnessing this for myself. There are a number of people killed here. I think you should know about it. And the duty officer, or whoever was running the desk at the time, news editor, I don't know, he said to me, well, I can't see anything on PA, which is the Press Association Newswire. I can't see anything on the Newswire at all. Therefore, I'm not really interested. I said, but, and I tried to explain that I also was a BBC staff reporter, and I'm telling you what I'm seeing, and I'm telling you what the police are reporting. But he wouldn't have it because it wasn't on the Newswire. So I learned a lesson that day, and I thought, if I was going to do this job properly, of actually telling the news to people, I need to be somewhere where the organisation is respected. I mean, it has changed now. Let's be fair, it's changed now. But I was horrified. I was horrified by this barrier, and I moved from there to television as a result of that. And it was an extraordinarily awful event. I mean, it really was. And the next day, when I saw the story in the papers, obviously it made the papers the next day, the Saturday, and I was physically sick. It's one of those things where at the time, and journalists will understand this, you're switched on. It's a great story, terrible human,
Well, I've read numerous accounts of that. Obviously, it was well before my time, but the people who witnessed it and the survivors were obviously greatly disturbed by what happened. And I think the most harrowing account I read of someone who was stood on a tube platform, they said they looked at the driver, and the driver seemed completely focused and not in any panic at all. The driver was just driving as though this was a normal journey. Yeah. The whole thing, I know it greatly disturbed a huge number of people. And you're right.
To this day, they don't. There was no reason for it. They've never really established why he did it, or whether it was his fault, or whether it was mechanical. We don't know.
It was a very, very strange thing. Those accounts I read of people just saying, the driver just looked like a normal tube driver, sat in his seat, didn't seem panicked at all. And it led to this horrendous tragedy. But you are right about journalism. Sometimes you've got to have sharp elbows and make the point, look, I've got a good story here, for crying out loud, listen to me. I've been in that position myself, and I learned quite early in my career, do be a little bit pushy sometimes if you know you're onto something. But, things have changed. But I'm going back. I'm glad you mentioned Norman de Mesquita. I think, knowing what I know about him, his two big sports really were cricket and ice hockey. I think that is to a very large extent where his expertise lie. But the reason I'm so familiar with that name, he died, maybe 5 years ago, but he was well known in the snooker fraternity, because for many, many years, the Benson Hedges Masters, which used to be held at the Wembley Conference Centre, it was independently run of the WPBSA, the games governing body, and as such, they had their own staff doing work there. And Norman was the announcer, the MC at the Benson Hedges Masters for many years, and he was a very popular man in the press room. Again, I never got to cover it. By the time I got involved in journalism, it was obviously no longer the Benson Hedges Masters by then, because tobacco sponsorship had been banned and the WPBSA had taken over the tournament anyway. But yeah, Norman was a very popular man in the snooker press rooms. Clive Everton knew him very well. And he was just one of those people, you know, cricket and ice hockey were his specialities. But yeah, he had a sound knowledge of most sports, I gather.
Yes, indeed. And he actually was one of those people who did help me out, actually. He sort of commented on one or two things I did. And again, it reminded me, during my second year at university, college, call it what you will, I got myself seconded to BBC Radio 2 Sports Desk. It was on Radio 2 in those days. And I was the sort of gopher. I did a little bit of this and a little bit of that, and I persuaded them to let me on air. They let me do the the racing results. I read the racing results, which was fantastic. You know, big breakthrough. But then the great Bryon Butler was there. Now, Bryon was football correspondent and also an expert on cricket, and never pushed himself at all. I mean, he was a great broadcaster. And I was reading a bulletin one day, and I didn't say anything. And he always smoked a pipe, always had a shirt and tie on. And he came over to me, sat down next to me, puffing his pipe. And he said to me, what about emphasis? He said, perhaps if you'd have emphasized that word or that word, or said it perhaps slightly this way, how do you think it would have sounded? And of course, he was absolutely right, 100% right. And again, you've opened up a memory. He took it upon himself to advise and help me, and I'm very grateful to him for that, because he was a big star, a big name in those days, and he didn't have to do that, but he wanted to help, and obviously clearly had been helping, you know, other reporters, journalists, broadcasters over the years, and that was very good. That was in the era of Peter Jones as well. Peter Jones.
Yeah, I was going to mention, and this was Peter Jones, Bryon Butler, and Sport on 2 as well, because obviously that only really changed when the original Radio 5 launched in the early 1990s. Prior to that, it was very much Sport on 2, and things like, you know, the FA Cup draw took place on the Jimmy Young show. And if there was a big race meeting going on in the afternoon, they would break out of David Hamilton or whoever's presenting the afternoon show, Radio 2 goes racing sort of thing. And I always remember there was a story I read about Peter Jones. I mean, obviously he died in 1990, so I can't really remember him. But I think he died covering the boat race, didn't he, in 1990?
I think he did, yes.
Yeah, that was the story. But the story about Peter Jones was the bosses above him at BBC Network Radio were not always keen on opting out of the normal evening programmes on Radio 2 to cover live, particularly European matches. And they used to say about Peter Jones, that man could charm the knickers off a nun. And that was the saying. And he always persuaded the bosses to at least let them cover the second half in full on the radio.
Yes. Yes.
And he just had this sort of charming thing. But Peter Jones, I mean, Bryon Butler, Peter Jones's talents went well beyond sports commentary. He was the radio foreman for, you know, the big royal occasions and stuff like that, and serious funerals. And he always said that his favourite thing to cover, it was an odd one, and it's not covered on the radio anymore. He said his favourite event of each year was the Royal Maundy on Maundy Thursday every year, which they used to cover on radio, and the Queen would hand out the Maundy money. Well, the service continues, it's just not on the radio anymore. But Peter Jones said of all the things he covered, that was his favourite. But it goes to show that in those days, perhaps people specialise a bit more nowadays, but in those days you had to have a breadth of abilities, didn't you, to really get on.
Well, he was a tremendous wordsmith, and he was a protege of Angus Mackay. Now, Angus Mackay was the father of radio sport, and a lot of what still goes on was invented by Angus Mackay. And during my secondment, when I was a student, Angus Mackay had a retiring party. Now, he started the routine of reading the scores off the teleprinter. You know, he did this on Sports Report years before television picked it up, and he would give reporters 60 seconds, and if they came in at 59 seconds or 1 minute 1 second, he would give them a hell of a talking to the next day. I mean, he was a Scottish, very strict and so on, but ran a really striking ship. And then during my time, he retired, and in the opposite BBC Broadcasting House, which is another hotel, it used to be that's my phone.
You're popular, Graham. You're popular.
Hang on. used to be the BBC Club. And in the BBC Club, they had a retirement party for Angus Mackay, and every single name you could think of for throughout the history of BBC Radio Sport up until that time. So you're talking sort of 30, 40 years of fantastic sport. All the names were there under one roof. Now, there was our young reporter, bored silly, of course. George Bernard Shaw said, "Youth is wasted on the young." What an opportunity missed.
Yeah.
I could have interviewed every one of them, and there was masses of stories, and to have been recorded for posterity. But of course, I didn't, because I was a young whippersnapper reporter. But I look back, what a wasted opportunity.
Well, just to be in the same room as them and to say hi to them, it's.
But he picked up Peter Jones. I mean, Peter Jones was a school teacher, and I can't tell you how they got together. But Angus Mackay said, in a very broad Scottish accent, "You've got to come and work for me at the BBC," and that was it. That was it. He turned himself into one of the best broadcasters of all time.
Yeah, he was one of the greats, certainly, and it must have been wonderful just to be around those people in that era. It was quite something. But you didn't stay in radio for that long, because I believe it wasn't that long after that Anglia Television came calling. Was it Anglia or HTV West you went to first?
No, it was Anglia. I went to Anglia in Norwich, where I did a bit of everything, which was a great learning experience. You mentioned earlier in vision continuity announcing. That was one of my roles. And of course you had no idea how much time you were going to get between programs. So you had to talk sensibly for 40 seconds leading into, I don't know, something like the Sweeney or whatever. And when you had to link over to news at 10, you had to come out on the 00 on the clock, or there'll be real trouble. But in vision continuity in those days was quite something. We had to wear a bow tie on a Saturday night and all sorts of things. But you learned very quickly how long 20 seconds really is. People say, "I'll be just a minute." They've got no idea what they're talking about. A minute is a long time. You can get a lot of information in a minute. And I also did a little bit of reporting, but also presenting About Anglia. Which
that was the main evening news program at the time, wasn't it?
Which was marvellous. I was, I don't know, 23, 24 when I was fronting this major news program for the whole region. And in those days, it covered both West and East. It was a big opportunity for me. No autocue, of course. It was all a bit of script and memory. And
so you were reading the news without an autocue?
Yeah. I could spend the next 3 hours telling you stories about how badly that went.
Well, I'll tell you something about that. Bob Warman, who still works on ITV Central, to this day, he keeps a copy of the Birmingham Evening Mail under his desk, just in case autocue goes down and everything else goes down. Now, nothing like that has happened for many, many years, and it's highly unlikely to happen these days. But Bob, even at his age now, takes no chances whatsoever.
I did exactly the same, and that's something I recommend to everybody who contacts me or writes to me and say, "What help can you give us?" And that's one of the first things I say. If you're doing a live program, for goodness sake, take scripts in. Don't leave yourself like the proverbial rabbit in the headlight. Just take something with you to fill the gap.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned in-vision continuity, because you've brought back a memory there, Graham. And again, I remember in-vision continuity on HTV West and HTV Wales, because I lived in Cardiff. Well, I still do live in Cardiff. I left for some years, but I came back. And HTV West, a lot of people's aerials were pointing to the Mendip transmitter rather than to the Wenbo transmitter in Cardiff, for reasons you'll know about. And but we had both in our house. And I remember the in-vision announcers, but I was looking up some old footage on YouTube recently of Tom Edwards at Thames.
Oh, yeah.
And Tom was the master at filling when things really went down, and a program would go down and tapes would break, which is quite common in those days. And there's some great footage on YouTube of him not knowing how long it's going to be before the program's up and running again. And he's got his copy of the TV Times, and he's going through each program that's on the following evening, but he's stretching out each sentence to last as long as he can by putting in all these little clauses mid-sentence sort of thing. And Tom filled it. He's an absolute master at this sort of thing. But that's how television was in those days. You've got to be like a swan, so to speak, looking calm and authoritative on screen, but your legs are paddling underneath, so to speak. So
absolutely right.
I'm guessing you had a few situations like that as well.
Many, many, many times like that. Tapes would always crash or go down, or something went wrong. And I had lots of. You mentioned the ITV Sport on a Saturday afternoon. We had a VT80 machine. It was that was supposed to transcribe the football results onto screen. It was forever breaking down, and I was filling desperately for most of my time there. But also, when you're covering sport for the main bulletins, when I was at ITN, news at 10, news at 5:40 or 5:45, and so on, so on, so on, because you were the sportsman, you were the end of the program, so you were the buffer. You know, if other items had overrun, you had to shorten your piece, or if other items above you had not gone to time, then you had to extend your piece to camera in order to fill the gap. So perhaps it was tremendous training for that.
Yeah, well, to me, that's what I primarily associate you with, because I was born in 1983, and certainly around about post 1993 onwards, towards the end of the decade, you were the sort of face of Saturday tea times on ITN. But there was a lot of things happened before then. So you started at Anglia. Am I right in saying Jerry Harrison would have been on sport around then?
Yeah, Jerry Harrison was the sort of Roger Malone of the of East Anglia. He did football for them for years and years and years, and he's well into his 80s now, and he's still working. He still loves his football, and he's still working for FIFA television, I think. But he was very good. You know, knew the players inside out, and was a very good operator. I worked alongside him several times, and yeah, a lot of time for Jerry.
Yeah, because he started out, there was a competition on Match of the Day in the late 60s, wasn't there? Find a commentator. And I think Jerry was runner-up in that. He lost to a guy called Idwal Robling, who was a Welsh fella, who went on to enjoy a career mainly at BBC Wales. But Jerry Harrison came second. I think Ian St. John came third. Of course, Ian St. John was already a household name because of his playing career, but he went on to have a good career as a broadcaster as well. But yeah, Jerry Harrison had a long career at Anglia, also at ITV Network, and in the years, particularly from the Premier League era onwards, commentating and administrating broadcasts for worldwide English language audiences. So yeah, Jerry is still very, very active. I'm aware of that, certainly. So you started at Anglia then, and then what my late father particularly remembers you from, HTV West came calling. And I imagine this was a great era because you had people like Bruce Hockin working there, who had the longest career, I think, of any regional newsreader. He was there from the 60s. I think he started at TWW, HTV's predecessor, so he was seen in both Wales and the West. But for me, when I was a kid, he was the face of HTV West News. You also had people like Richard Wyatt working there at that time.
You're saying that there was no intention of evading the code then?
Oh, absolutely none, absolutely none.
Problems with the pay code. Mr. Glyn England, the recently appointed chairman of the Central Electricity Board, is at present on a tour of the nuclear power stations along the Bristol Channel, the biggest nuclear power concentration in Europe. Well, he was at Berkeley yesterday and Albury-on-Severn today. He said that there have been discussions for 3 more nuclear power stations at Portbury near Portishead, Port Skewett near Caldecott, and another one at Albury itself. Well, the new chairman toured the Albury-on-Severn nuclear power station today after giving a progress report on the industry. He said he wanted to step up the development of nuclear power stations, and with the 3 sites mentioned, the West is likely to continue to have more stations than any other region in Europe. Well, people living near the present nuclear sites are constantly expressing their fears. So I asked the chairman, how safe are they?
Our own experience, and that's now very considerable, is that they are very safe. We've been running reactors for 15 years. In total, our experience is equivalent to 1 reactor running for 180 years. And I'm advised that in the whole of that time, there's been no harm attributable to radiation to any of our workers or to any of our neighbours.
You say the progress of power stations is good and also that they are very safe. Are there any plans to build any more?
Not just at the moment, because currently we have sufficient electricity generating plant to meet the demands of customers now and for the next few years. But fairly soon we shall be wanting to progress to place more orders for power stations of various sorts, including nuclear stations.
Here in the Bristol Channel we have one of the highest conglomeration of nuclear stations in Europe. Is the Bristol Channel again in your sights?
Yes, the Bristol Channel has made a very significant contribution to the development of nuclear power, and there are some other sites which have been discussed in public which could be developed at some time for further nuclear stations.
There's a great website that exists on the internet, the history of regional football on ITV, and it's one for the anoraks, but it's great fun. And it goes through it season by season, which regions showed which matches on whichever Sunday afternoon. And of course, in the West and in Wales, HTV, we didn't have our own regular program every week, but there were occasional opt-outs, soccer specials instead of the big match from LWT. And there's a picture of you, a screenshot of you presenting from about the early 80s. I'm guessing it was from one of the Bristol grounds. That must have been good fun to work on in that era.
It was remarkable because you were so alone covering those matches as a broadcaster, and it's so different from today. It was recorded onto videotape, and when there was an incident like a penalty or indeed a goal, what happened was, Smith would pass to Jones and Jones would score. You had to remember the process. You had to remember the sequence of events that led up to the goal or led up to the penalty, and the game would carry on, of course, as it would, and the recording carried on as it would, and then over those pictures you had to then re-commentate from your memory what led up to the goal, and you never knew if you were right or not. You didn't have an opportunity, and then at the end of the match you do other reports and interviews. And it was sent from Bristol, for example, down to London Weekend Television, who had the only machinery who could do this. And they would turn it round into a programme and then send it back for transmission on Sunday afternoon, because HTV didn't have the facility, nor did the other regions come to that. And when it went to air, you just cross your fingers and hope you got it reasonably correct. I mean, nowadays, you see a goal, you see it from 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 different angles, and you can commentate over the different angles, so you absolutely bang on as to what happened. Not very sophisticated, you might say, but then again, the audience was less sophisticated. I don't think the audience expected more than they got in those days. But
these were different times, because you look at, I mean, they're repeated a lot on BT Sport now and on ITV4 as well. A lot of these old regional Sunday afternoon football programs, the Big Match from LWT, or the Granada equivalent called Kick-Off, and some of the programs from TVS on the South Coast are shown as well, with Fred Dinage hosting those. They're shown on BT Sport a lot. They're occasionally shown on ITV4 as well. And what you realise, and I noticed looking at that website about regional football on ITV, up at Tyne Tees, for example, their Sunday afternoon programme called Shoot was regarded as somewhat primitive by comparison, because they just didn't have the resources. But what used to happen there is, if World of Sport were covering a horse racing meeting from the Tyne Tees region, their one outside broadcast unit would be needed at the racing, and therefore on the Sunday afternoon they'd have no choice but to take the Big Match from London, because there just wasn't another outside broadcast unit from Tyne Tees to cover football that day. So Tyne Tees viewers was like, why is London so more glitzy than us? Well, they didn't have the resources, as you say. But Sunday afternoon local football on HTV was a rare treat in those days. It wasn't every week by any means, was it?
No, it wasn't. I mean, Bristol City were then in the First Division, which is the Premier League now. They had 4 seasons there, and obviously they got relegated in the last of those 4. But they had a reasonably good team with some great characters, and we used to cover them as often as we could. I remember one particular game against Nottingham Forest, managed by one Bryon Clough, and I tried to get my interview with him, and of course I don't do interviews, young man, and all that. Again, there's little things like that, but tremendous experience, because you're in awe of these people. You're young and they're well established. But yeah, from my point of view, covering those matches as a broadcaster, literally live, and then the edit happened out of your hands. It was a nervy time, just hoping you got it right. And occasionally, if you got it wrong, there'll be letters in the local paper, which is fair enough.
Oh, we all get a bit of stick from some no matter what. It's not much you can do about that. I mean, I always think back to what the late Richard Whiteley on Countdown used to say, what he used to do when he was reading the local news programme on Yorkshire Television Calendar. When the nasty letters came in, he just pinned them to his dressing room wall, and he used it as wallpaper. That was the way to approach that.
I remember once asking Peter Jones, saying, "Well, the radio reporter, how do you know the names of the foreign players when English clubs are playing abroad?" And he sort of looked over each shoulder and he whispered to me. He said, "Well, who's going to know I'm getting it wrong?" But of course, nowadays they do, because nowadays we see it, as well as hear it. But so that was his way round. It's if he didn't know, perhaps he'd make it up. But
I always remember Angus Loughran saying that in the early days of Eurosport, it may have been Sky Sports, but I think it was Eurosport. He was commentating on ice hockey for them, and it was a Russian international game, or it may even have been the USSR still at that stage. And he was expecting a fax to come through with the name of all the players and information about them. Oh, you are a popular man today, Graham.
I am. I should have taken that off at the beginning. Okay.
It's all right. But anyway, this fax didn't come through, and they were just minutes away from broadcast, and he had no information whatsoever about any of these Russian ice hockey players. So the way he went around it was to think of the names of 5 Russian presidents or Soviet presidents, and he allocated a name to each of the players, and he did the commentary pretending they were whoever, Khrushchev, whoever, Stalin, Lenin, you name it. And guess what? Not one complaint came in. Nobody had a clue. But, different, you would never get away with that now. And because you just have so much more, we can find out about, I don't know, the Belarusian league just by typing it into Google and getting all sorts of information on our fingertips, which just wasn't possible then. But so HTV West, you worked with Roger Malone as well. Now, I remember Roger very well because he was working on sport on HTV West well into the 1990s. What was he like to work with?
Well, Roger was a fantastic character, a great journalist. I don't think he and television ever quite got it sorted out, because he was around at ITV before the days of Bryon Moore. And I think if Roger had got his act together a little bit better, he would have been the Bryon Moore that we all came to know and love and respect. Roger would talk a lot. I remember vividly where he was presenting in the studio one particular sports show. I was co-presenting with him. And we had earpieces by then, and we could hear what was going on in the gallery. And he'd been given 20 seconds to talk about some story. And about 50 seconds later, he was still talking. and I remember vividly the gallery saying to the floor manager, who we still had at the time, saying, "Throw a brick at him, chop off his legs, move him, throw a chair at him." He just wouldn't stop talking. And I don't think he ever understood the need of sticking to time, keeping to the second. Television is all about timing, and so is radio. I don't think he ever understood that. I think he was a newspaper man through and through, and didn't really get the timing situation that you absolutely need to follow in television and radio. But a character, tremendous character.
Yeah, and also you mentioned there Brian Clough. You could never quite tell where things were going if you were even trying to interview him, because I always remember Dave Clark, who's just stood down as Sky's darts host. Sadly, he's had to take early retirement due to Parkinson's disease. But I always remember him telling a story when he was a reader on Sky Sports News, the day Brian Clough died. I remember Dave Clark was on shift that day in late 2004, I think it was. And Dave said that he went to interview Cloughie. This was after Cloughie had retired, and he went to interview him, and not knowing what to expect, he'd heard that alcoholism had taken its toll and not knowing. And Dave Clark, they sat down wherever they'd agreed to meet. And Cloughie said to Dave Clark, he said, "Young man, never wear a cheap tie with an expensive suit." And that was just his way of unsettling him. But there's a load of footage just show, because Sky Sports are raiding the archives during lockdown, and they've put a load of clips from the early years of the Premier League on their YouTube channel. And Martin Tyler was trying to interview him in the first year of the Premier League, which of course was Cloughie's last year with Nottingham Forest. And Tyler asked him a fairly straightforward question, and Nottingham Forest were struggling near the bottom of the league. And Cloughie started to say to him, "Oh, Martin, how's your wife? How are your lovely children at the moment?" And I'm thinking, well, this is live television and you're going off on this unbelievable tangent. So you never quite knew what you were getting with Cloughie, did you?
That's what made him a lovely character. I mean, his record on the pitch was extraordinary for Sunderland. How many goals did he score in 200 goals in, 100 goals in 200 matches, whatever it is. You look up his record, it's absolutely phenomenal. But there were great stories about him, and he was just as maverick as a player. Apparently, he stormed into the England selection committee. It was never done by one person in his time, and he couldn't understand why he wasn't in the first 11. He was about 18 at the time. He was just a maverick, but what a great character and a marvellous manager and a terrific footballer. I mean, his career was sadly cut short by a knee injury, which today would have, he'd been up and running again within 6 weeks, but times were different and his career was over, but a wonderful character.
Well, yeah, that he tells a story in the last book he wrote about that knee injury, and he says that Bob Stokoe, who was the manager of Sunderland when they won the FA Cup, he said that Bob Stokoe was standing over him, accusing him of faking it, and he never forgave Stokoe for that. One of the other people who was in that team, I think it was Sunderland against Doncaster, if I remember rightly. Another person who was in that team, that Doncaster team, was Charlie Williams, who later became well known as a comedian and a television presenter. I think he did the Golden Shot after Bob Monkhouse left the first time, and he was in that Doncaster team. And Brian Clough's last book where he talks about that, and he does. I can't remember it because I haven't read it for years, but the Sunderland goal scoring record, he mentions it about 10 times, at least once per chapter. He's repeating that again and again, you know.
Yeah, it was a phenomenal record and something to be extremely proud of.
Oh yeah. But back to yourself then. So HTV West, that ended, 1983-ish, I think you moved on, and Thames News came calling, and you appeared with ex-ITN man Andrew Gardner, weren't you?
I did, yes. I went down as sports correspondent to Thames News. I took over from Steve Ryder, who I think went over to the BBC at that time, and Mike Morris was my producer. He went on to present TVAM.
Oh, he was great, wasn't he? He was great on TVAM. Yeah, sadly no longer with us.
No, nor is Andrew, sadly. Lovely man and a tremendous broadcaster, and loved the gossip. Oh, he was a blotting paper for gossip, and he'd readily pass it on. And he also liked silly jokes as well. So he was great fun. And I shared a dressing room with Jack Scott, the weatherman. Now, Jack had been BBC weatherman for years and years and years. And in retirement, Thames brought him over as their weatherman. And he was another great character and a teller of stories, and loved his golf. And it was a very interesting time. When I joined, Thames News had just taken over from the Eamon Andrews show. And Eamon Andrews was a big sort of showbiz man of his time. Did a lot of sport as well for the BBC. So we inherited crews from those days. I went out to do a news story which had, 90 seconds in the program, and I had a crew of about 12 people. 2 cameramen, 2 lighting men, this, that, and the other.
Those really were the days, yeah.
Absolutely ridiculous. They didn't do anything. 80% of the crew did nothing at all. And why would they?
This was unionized, wasn't it? This was the thing.
Yes. Oh yes. Nothing must be done. So those were happy days. But also, you mentioned the union. If you covered a fire, you turned up at a fire, for example, and the house was burning down, the crew would still be sitting in the car, and you'd have to knock on the window. Would you mind starting filming now? And out they got and filmed it. Times have changed. Absolutely, times have changed. But it was very interesting working in and around London, because you got to know a lot of the people who literally ran sport, for example, quite well, and it was also the days of tremendous boxing characters, from Frank Bruno to the Dark Destroyer, Lennox Lewis, of course. And I got quite close to each and all of them in my time. And it was a fascinating time. Boxing is such an extraordinary sport. If you think about it, it should be banned, but nevertheless.
I know what you mean, and that era for British boxing, the late 80s into the early 90s, Nigel Benn, Chris Eubank, Michael Watson, it was a tremendous era. But your work at Thames then, right the way for the remainder of the 80s into the early 1990s, you presented in New Year's Eve 1992 the last ever news bulletin on Thames.
I did. I was the captain of the ship. I took him down, didn't I? I mean, it was by that time Andrew had already retired. I don't think he wanted to take them down. He thought, no, this won't do me any good. So he'd already retired, and it's left to me to do the last ever Thames News programme, which was an honour in one way, but very, very sad in another, because a lot of people literally were out of a job, as was I. I mean, it was very tough, and because I was front of screen, because I was what they call talent, dreadful word. I wasn't on the staff, I was freelance. So I didn't get any of the payoffs that the staff did, and neither did any of the other presenters, because that wasn't the contract we were obliged to sign. So it was a very tough time.
And that's it, the final Thames News. To those who follow, good luck. From those of us here, thanks for your good wishes, thanks for watching, and goodbye.
It would have been, because I take an interest in, I've read books on it actually, the 1991 ITV franchise round, and there's always this thing hanging over, was the Death on the Rock documentary that upset Margaret Thatcher part of the factor that led to Thames losing their licence? I've never been convinced on that, because I think the bidding system was flawed, and Thames having those huge studios and having the production arm meant that they were always likely to be outbid, and I gather the consensus among the staff was it was 50-50 whether they would hang on. And they didn't. What was your take on it?
Well, I could never understand it, because Thames was making money. It's for the directors, for the shareholders, and the programs were being shown all over the world. The Benny Hill show was everywhere, making huge amounts of money, and Thames' name was large and respected. They were making films, and everything was done in-house. There were no outsourcing. Everything was done under one roof. And in Carlton, who were literally just a name off a shelf, they had nothing. They didn't have any staff. They didn't have any production facilities whatsoever. They literally came in with a higher bid and got the license. Now, as you say, there are all sorts of stories how on earth that took place. Maybe Thames didn't take it seriously enough. Maybe they're given the wrong information. Nobody will ever know. But they lost the license to Carlton, which was apart from the personal side, as far as I was concerned, and my colleagues, to lose a production house of that standing, of that quality, of that worldwide reputation on a piece of paper with numbers on was just ridiculous.
I would argue that having read, I think Andrew Davidson's book, Under the Hammer, is probably the best book to read if you want to understand all that went on in the 1991 franchise round. The legislation, the 1990 Broadcasting Act, was fundamentally flawed in all sorts of ways. And there were three things in it. One of them was money. That was the first thing. It was highest bidder. Then there was exceptional circumstances. And then there was another thing, sort of if you bid too high, and they said that would compromise your ability to make good programs, which is why I think in the Northwest, that's why Granada held on, because I think there was a consortium with Phil Redmond that bid higher. But they said, the ITC said, if you bid this high, you're not going to have any money left to make programs. So it was flawed. It was like a very silly game of poker, if you like, who holds on to their franchise and who doesn't. And it wasn't fair. It was exceptional, highest bidder, exceptional circumstances, and TVAM were hoping to hold on with exceptional circumstances because of their track record in the Gulf War reporting. But yeah, it was called quality threshold. And if you bid too high, you would lose the quality threshold. And the staff at Thames, the ones I've had dealings with, they said, we thought it was 50-50. And was that Death on the Rock episode of This Week part of the factor? Nobody was quite sure, but it was sad to lose, because you look at it, whether it's Benny Hill, Des O'Connor Tonight, and everything, whether it's documentary making, light entertainment, sport, Thames had a reputation for quality. And whilst they continued as an independent production company for a long time afterwards, and indeed still do in a certain guise, it was a shame to lose that nucleus at Teddington and at Euston Road, wasn't it?
Absolutely. And what a waste of talent from all those people I worked with. I mean, many of them just retired. Many of them were never seen again and went into different areas of work and what have you. Just a loss of talent. Looking back, you think, how on earth could it have happened? I mean, you've described it very well, but they were dark days. It was a horrible time, to be honest, a horrible time.
Yeah, and Carlton, you mentioned how Carlton worked. Their entire business model was Michael Green was in charge of it. He appointed a head of drama, head of current affairs, and he sent out a tender document to independent production companies. And in fact, all their programs were made by independent production companies in London. Exactly. They didn't make any of their own. And Carlton got off to a very bad start, shall we say, in 1993, and it took them quite a while to recover from that. But because they were effectively buying in programs from independent production companies, it never had as though you were sort of part of a team that would have existed at Thames, if that makes sense.
Yes, it does. And you're quite right. And that team ethic, that teamwork is worth a lot. It's priceless, because everybody's working for everybody else and you generally know everybody else. There's a lovely positive atmosphere to work in it, and it's helpful for the product that actually comes out at the end of the day. And you can't have that if you're outsourcing your programs to different companies, different independent companies around the region and beyond. There's no way everybody's going to know each other, and it missed out a lot, in my view. Carlton they weren't up to the standard of Thames. I would say that, wouldn't I? But I just think the whole thing is a very, it's a very dark day for British television.
Yes, I think so, yes. But for you then, life went on, and this is where I first saw you, really. You were the face of Saturday tea times on ITN. And this is an interesting era for ITV in general, particularly on Saturday afternoons, because World of Sport had long since ended. That ended in the autumn of 1985. But then from 1985 till the end of the 91-92 football season, Results Service used to come on air at 4:40 on a Saturday afternoon, with generally presented by Elton Wellesby, who might even be listening to this podcast. I'm in touch with Elton. And that would be... They particularly relied on independent local radio reporters to feed in reports of matches, and they would have a full classified check with Bob Colston. And that continued right the way up until the end of the 91-92 season. And then a decision was made to get rid of Results Service and incorporate the Sports Roundup on the ITN teatime news bulletins. So typically that would mean either Nicholas Owen or Carol Barnes would be alongside yourself. And I imagine putting that together during the course of a Saturday afternoon with all these results coming in, reports coming in, footage coming in, will it come in or won't it come in? Because technology then wasn't as instant as it is now, not by a long way. I imagine working on that would have been quite intense on a Saturday afternoon.
It was intense, Marcus, but I tell you, I loved every second of it. It was such fun because we actually went on air before the games had finished. So you didn't know what was going to happen. And of course, in terms of league tables, you were reliant on this technology that always failed you. So I had to go in there with bits of paper and trying to work out what this meant in terms of who was top of the table and what have you. And I loved every second. And because I was a sports fan, I love football, and I would have been interested anyway as to what was happening on a Saturday afternoon at full time. What does this mean to them? How did they get on, and so on? I was actually just speaking it, but delivering it to the nation as a fan as well as a broadcaster, and I enjoyed it. It was tremendous fun. And the lovely Bob Colston, who was a real pro, because he had to read his scores when all mayhem was going on around him, and he just carried on regardless. I would say the VT80 machine that I mentioned earlier, it went down at least 3 times a month. So, I mean, you were always on the edge as to what was happening. And then we tried a period of going to commercial radio reporters at grounds. And again, there was a bit of a union dispute. So I would say, no, we're going over to Marcus at White Hart Lane. What happened, Marcus? How did Spurs win? What were they like? Or whatever the link, you came up with. And then there was a pause. Somebody hadn't switched it because of this union dispute, so it was left to you. Oh well, we can't reach Marcus at the moment at White Hart Lane, but I can tell you Spurs beat Arsenal by 3-1, and the goals were scored by Ian Wright, and so on and so on. So you had to be on the edge of your seat all the time, and I loved it. And for a sports fan, for a football fan, to be in that position at that time was just heaven. I mean, I loved it.
It would have been tremendous, because it's one of those things. No matter how much you prepare, and no matter how well prepared, things are going to go wrong. Things are going to change, as you've already alluded to. If there were news items beforehand that had to be extended, you'd have to cut back what you had to say. If they were running short, you'd have to extend what you were planning to say. And think about who was there, Nicholas Owen, Carol Barnes, John Suchet, Dennis Toohey. These were all great pros in their own right.
They were. It was a privilege to work alongside them, and none of them knew anything about sport, of course. So you couldn't really have a chat with them if anything was going wrong. They would look the other way. Don't bring me into this. I haven't got a clue. So it was all down to you, and they would literally switch off when they handed over to sport.
I think Dennis knows a bit, doesn't he?
Yes. I only worked with him a few times because he was mainly. He was slightly on a different channel at the time, but the others really didn't have a great deal of interest in sport. But the point is, they would leave you alone. They wouldn't get involved. They would always absolutely get on with it. So which made it all the more fun.
From the studios of ITN, the news and sport with Carol Barnes and Graham Miller.
Good evening. Welcome to the programme. The headlines tonight. Sinn Féin confirmed they will rejoin the peace talks on Monday. Kate Winslet en route for the Oscars, who she thinks should get Best Actress.
And in sport, England collapsed to the lowest ever test score in Antigua.
Now, today's sports news, and with the details, here's Graham Miller.
England's hopes of winning the 6th test and levelling the series against the West Indies look to have collapsed along with their batting. England were all out for 127 in their first innings, and the West Indies are 79 for no wickets in reply. Peter Staunton reports.
Again, you had the earpiece to the gallery, and I remember being on. I was doing the news channel between 2 o'clock and 6 o'clock or something, and you come out of the football results, and you did all of that, and you were coming to the end of your shift, and bless her, the Queen Mum died.
Oh, yeah, 2002.
Because I was sport, I was never involved in the rehearsals, because no secret that for obviously all the big names in and around the country, there's always obits ready, sadly, for when they pass, so that all the news can be up to date. So I was never involved in all the rehearsals for the Queen Mum, who'd been dying for a long time. Bless her. And suddenly she died on my shift. So I remember vividly, a producer ran into the studio and literally dropped a sort of 25-page wad of notes in front of me on what you can and can't do.
Now, Graham, let me ask you, because I know Peter Sissons on the BBC, the late Peter Sissons now, sadly, he got into a lot of trouble for wearing a burgundy tie. Rather than a black one. And he explained in his excellent autobiography called When One Door Closes, he explained everything that went on there. He admitted that some of the questions he asked weren't his finest hour, but the actual tie thing, which he got crucified for in the tabloid press a couple of days later, on the Monday in particular, he said that was actually BBC policy. Now, let me ask you, Graham, what colour was your tie that day?
Well, it certainly wasn't black. I mean, that was sort of rule number one. You've got to wear a black tie. But I've just been presenting the sports shift for 4 hours. So, I mean, I didn't have a black tie on me, and there was nobody in wardrobe to give me a black tie. So I just carried on with whatever tie I was wearing. But it was a smooth movement from covering sport to a royal departure, and I had to switch back onto my news days and talk to all sorts of people in a variety of circumstances. There was mayhem in the gallery. Nobody knew what was happening next, and you were trying to keep afloat of everything that was going on. And it was it was great fun again, because it was down to you as frontman to keep the show on the road, and they were sort of following you rather than you being directed, as is the normal case. And I was happy to do that. It was just something I enjoyed doing. And they'd say, "Oh, so and so's on the phone. Talk to him," or talk to her, and off you went, and you just carried on on the seat of your pants. But it was. It's not a good thing to say it was good fun doing a royal funeral, but from a presenting point of view, it was the challenge that
it's the adrenaline rush, and that's one of the things I enjoy most about. It's why I think mainly I always will prefer radio to television, because I like the spontaneity of it and the way it can suddenly change tack. Now, the same thing can happen on rolling news channels, as you've just demonstrated. But I'm guessing, you prepared for an afternoon of sport, and you've done everything you possibly could to prepare properly for that, and then wallop, this thing is landed in front of you just as after you've been working all afternoon. The Queen Mother has died. You're relying on people like, who was the royal editor? Tim Hewitt would it have been at that time as well? I'm guessing he would have been brought into it, and you're just relying on whoever is there. That adrenaline rush, you've got to get this right, and just ask common sense questions. Really, that's quite something in live broadcasting, isn't it?
It is. I mean, you say bring in the senior reporters. They were on the golf course or down by the beach. They went around. It was Saturday afternoon. They were non-contactable, so you had to rely on whoever and whatever was around. And I was talking to various aging actors who'd been friendly with the Queen Mum, and I was asking them questions, and nothing was coming back. And I could hear the director in saying, "Oh, sorry, we understand he's deaf." So you're trying to conduct an interview down the phone line with everybody screaming and shouting, with a poor guy who's deaf. But did the audience ever know? I don't suppose they did, because of the drama and the solemnity of the whole thing. I don't suppose anybody really got annoyed by it. But from a presenting point of view, it was the Moorgate tube crash all over again. It's something that keeps you going, and it's something that you, as a journalist, as a reporter, as a presenter, it's these are the days you want, because that's the nature of the job.
It tests you, and it stretches your ability, and you get to see, are you made for this? And you pulled it off. You pulled it off a number of times in your career in that sense. But I remember there's a great Twitter feed of somebody who posts old edition of the Radio Times and the TV Times, and there was an edition of the TV Times from around about 1993-94, and it said ITV Evening News, Graham Miller on sport, followed by Bullseye with Jim Bowen, the guest dart player throwing for charity, Graham Miller. And it was Graham Miller followed by Graham Miller. I think I pointed that out to you on Twitter at the time. It appeared on Twitter some months ago, but that made me laugh, that particular thing.
But it wasn't me, of course. There was an English international dart player called Graham Miller, and we used to, when I was at Thames, I used to interview him a lot, because he was in his prime when I was at Thames, and it was really quite weird. Yes, it was very strange, very strange.
Yeah. And your role at ITN went well beyond Saturday afternoon sport, because you covered World Cups, you covered Olympics, and you stayed with ITN throughout the 1990s, but towards the end of the 90s into the early 2000s, the Channel 5 factor came in, and there was a change of emphasis in how news was presented. And Saturday afternoons, more often than not, as time went on, people like Felicity Barr and Gary Orris started presenting the sports bulletins on the Tea Time Bulletin. But you stayed with ITN for a good few years longer. But then you weren't chosen to cover the 2002 World Cup in Japan and South Korea. ITN sent Mark Austin. You, as you say, you presented shifts on the ITV News channel. But towards the end of 2002, there was a bidding war to retain the ITV News contract, and ITN held on to it. They fought off a bid from Sky News, but at a vastly reduced price. The amount of money they were receiving from ITV for doing the news was cut, and there were 75 job losses. Towards the end of 2002, you sensed it was time to move on.
Well, yes, I did. And it was a very difficult time again, because, as you say, ITN had to reduce the budget considerably, and covering news is expensive, particularly around the world. And we just couldn't do it anymore. And a new editor came in, and his brief was to save money, get rid of staff. And there was a cull. And his idea was, I mean, it's logical on paper. His idea at the time was, if a story's worth covering on News at 10, a good reporter can cover it. So whether it's sport or business or medical or whatever it happens to be, a good reporter can cover it. So we don't need specialist reporters. We can get rid of the medical correspondent, get rid of the business correspondent, get rid of the sports correspondent, who was me, and we can save ourselves a lot of money. So I was one of those who was culled, unfortunately, and so my ITN days were gone. It was quite brutal, quite ruthless. I think anybody at the time will tell you that, and then it continues. I mean, that's show business, I suppose.
But the logic behind that, though, saying we don't need specialist correspondents, is something I disagree with, because you take for example now, where we are in this day and age, some of the very best journalism I've seen in the last few weeks is Steve Scott for ITV News exposing what's gone on in British gymnastics with institutional abuse, it seems to be, and to me, and he's been exposing this night after night on News at 10. I think the last week or the week before, we had about 3 nights in a row of Steve's reports. Now, Steve is a very good journalist who happens to specialize in sport. And when you're listening, when there's, the economic crash of 2008, for example, I want somebody with a solid background in economics explaining in a palpable way to the ordinary viewer what all this means in real terms. And specialist knowledge is a very valuable thing. And I think it's a shame that they discarded with that so quickly. And also, yes, I'm a great believer you have to encourage and bring through young talent, but I think they were a little bit too brutal in getting rid of the likes of Carol Barnes and sidelining Nicholas Owen and people like that. I think they were far too harsh the way they did that round about that era. But this was the beginning, really, late 2002, wasn't it, of the cutbacks in news and it having to be done much more cheaply than in the past.
Yes, absolutely. And inevitably, 2 or 3 years later, the specialists came back. But yes, the whole thing was, you weren't covering news on the strength of a story. You were covering news on the cost of news gathering it. I mean, I remember coming in on several mornings, and at the time there was just one satellite dish. We used to transmit stories via this little satellite dish from wherever you were back to ITN House to go out to the nation. And I came in of a morning with a story or a suggested story, and they say, no. As you know, we're sharing the satellite dish with TVS today, the company who covers the south of England. They've got the dish down in Southampton. So can you find a story in Southampton? And that's where you're going. So news gathering had turned round 360 degrees. It wasn't the strength of the story. It was where the technology was in order to cover it and feed it back and to make good use of the facilities, of the infrastructure. Now that's the wrong way to go in my book. Always will be. The news should stand on its own value, and it shouldn't only appear because you've got the technology in the right place. But
this is part of the problem, was it? Because obviously, what began as the ITN News channel was later rebranded the ITV News channel, but they didn't seem to be committed to it in terms of resources. And I sensed that as a student at the time, flicking between that and Sky News and the BBC News channel. In terms of resources, they never committed to it in the way they needed to make it a long-term success, did they?
No, they didn't. And most of the country knew their regions. If you lived in Manchester, you knew you were Granada. If you lived in Norwich, you knew you were Anglia. And that's, in terms of branding, that is priceless. You couldn't afford to actually start branding your TV companies like that. But everybody had grown up with it and knew where they were. And suddenly, the powers that be decided to scrap all of that and call it ITV. ITV whatever. And in my view, that was a huge mistake. You lost so much value and so much connection. I mean, particularly in the regions. Certainly in my time, you were a valued member of the household. You know, ITV in the regions was huge. Everybody would watch, and you became quite a character in those regions. You know, you're seen as part of the family in many ways. And I often remember I'd left HTV Bristol and went to London, and I was covering football for the Sunday Mirror. And I covered a match down at Swindon. So I hadn't been in the West Country working for about, 3 years. And I walked through the car park of Swindon Town Football Club, and a chap came up to me and he said, "Here, Graham, where have you been on holiday?" You know, as far as he was concerned, I was still at HTV. And that to me is a priceless thing that has been thrown away, which is a huge shame.
Well, you're correct, because, you know, you think about it now, even in this day and age, Tyne Tees, for example, Mike Neville, Granada, Bob Greaves, Tony Wilson, Central, Bob Warman, whether it's TVS, Meridian, Fred Dinage, people associate these names with their region. And ITV, particularly their actions in the early 2000s, when you ended up with two companies, Granada and Carlton, effectively owning all the regions, and then they eventually merged to create ITV PLC. Yes, you had to move with the times, I suppose, you're in the multi-channel era, but the baby was thrown out with the bathwater, so to speak. And they tried doing news on the cheap, and they got rid of valued brands. Because like the name Granada, you hear that and you go to Manchester, and you used to see in the city centre as your train pulled in the Granada skyline with those big red letters on top of their building, Granada Television. And you associate Granada with World in Action and high-level drama and Coronation Street, and Granada Reports had a very strong following in the Northwest. To throw all that away, I think, was a terrible mistake. And in terms of throwing those brands away, something important was lost. And I don't think we've ever really got that back.
No, I think you're absolutely right. And it's a great shame. And I think a lot of people now realize that. But of course, you can't put the pieces back together again. I mean, at ITN, when I was doing those Saturday night shifts, granted, we followed a variety show and we preceded the Saturday night film. But those ITN bulletins on a Saturday night, we were getting audience figures of 9-10 million. Can you believe it? 9-10 million just for a news program.
Yeah.
And nowadays, they get 1 million. They break open the champagne. All right, there are more channels now. Things have changed. I accept all that. But that's how much people watched and relied upon the news from a reliable source with characters and reporters they knew. And I think that a lot of that has gone now. People like to know who they're watching. People like to get used to the people who pop up in their living rooms night after night after night, because that's how it works. And if there's a whole range of new people every time, they can't relate to that. And I think news broadcasting suffers as a result.
That's correct. And I've got nothing against anyone who is working in that nowadays. There's some terrific people there, but their shelf life on screen is very often quite short. And people who were on the screen a lot 10, 15 years ago have just seemed to have vanished into other roles now. And they don't have that same connection of people of previous eras for the reasons you outlined. Life is so much more fragmented. Television is so much more fragmented. We are all doing our own thing, watching Netflix or Amazon Prime, or we've got access to several hundred channels. Times have changed in an absolutely enormous way. So life beyond 2002, you set up your own company, but we'll talk about more about that in a second. But you didn't disappear. You were still broadcasting. You worked as a reporter on Gillette Soccer Saturday. I remember you on there. And I think even before that stage, when you were still at ITN, you did do some work, didn't you, for the London News Network, which was the amalgamated 7-day-a-week news service for Carlton and LWT. You were involved in that for a period, weren't you?
Well, yes, I was. When I went freelance again, and obviously as a freelance, you work for everybody. I was doing pretty much the same kind of work, but for different organisations. But from my point of view, because you weren't there all the time, as we were talking about earlier, it never had that same kind of camaraderie for me as working in some of the companies I had done down the years. But yes, I sort of I did that for a while, but then I thought I'd come to a point, and I thought, well, I've done it all. I've had a privileged career front of screen, as you mentioned. You name it, Olympic Games, World Cups, and so on and so forth. So I set up my own company after that and carried on covering stories for different broadcasters. I worked for the Olympic Broadcasting Service, which covers all the Olympic Games. I worked for them for 10 years or whatever it is. But I also ran my own company, just sort of helping people with their presentation skills. We produce videos and do general public relations work and so on, which is ongoing now, and I thoroughly enjoy it. It's the same kind of work I've always done, but A, you're working for yourself, and B, you've got a whole range of different people who you're connected with and working, and I find that just as exciting as ever. I love what I do. I always have done, and even though I'm 109, I carry on.
Well, because I think now it wasn't that many years ago that you were reading sports bulletins on Sky News, and I think on occasion Sky Sports News, and you were a reporter for Gillette Soccer Saturday. You've done stuff for CNN, for Today FM in Ireland, and you are Royal Television Society Sports Presenter of the Year. You've won that twice, so it's quite an illustrious career. Do you miss day-to-day broadcasting?
Yes, I do, in as much as I've done it for so long. You do get out of, that's what I enjoy doing. That's why I went into the business. That's what really got me involved. So I miss that daily broadcasting, but I find the work I'm doing now just as satisfying and just enjoyable. And it's taken me into new areas where I've had to learn new tricks of the trade, new ways of doing things, and technology now has just changed beyond belief. And we used to go abroad for ITM, for example, we'd carry crates and crates and crates of kit. Nowadays, you can do it on your mobile phone and it's better quality. So you can do so much more now than you used to. You don't need the satellite truck. You can just send an email. I mean, technology is remarkable. And it's getting better and better. And whenever we do get 5G, I know it's a bit controversial, whenever we do get 5G, it'll become even easier to transmit from wherever you are. So there's a tremendous future out there, and I'm eager to be part of it and get involved in it, and happy to carry on what I'm doing. I mean, what tended to happen was that program budgets were slashed and the staff were being slashed, but programs still wanted certain things covered. So my company would go and cover those events on behalf of the organizer, and then we'd feed the footage to the different broadcasters who wanted the story. So they would still get their footage, they would still get the story they wanted without committing their own crew, without it costing them any money out of their budget, and we'd be paid by the promoter of the event. So there was a lot of that going on, and it still does, but it's that type of work now. We're always going to produce stuff that's A, broadcast quality, and B, follows all the rules and regulations. So, thankfully I have that. People know that if they're going to get something from me, it's going to be of the right standard, because I'm very old fashioned in terms of quality, and I scream and shout at the screen sometimes when I say something.
Well, even I do that at 36 years of age. Me. But so this business you've involved now, Media View, have I pronounced that correctly?
Yes.
Yeah. Because I've looked at your website, and you're partners with a variety of businesses, sports federations, individuals, advising them on media strategy. I think the advice you've given, I'm a former sports reporter for local television here in Cardiff, the former City TV channel, and I wish I'd read the 5 points you got for people adapting from radio to television. I wish I'd read that 7-8 years ago when I had made that adjustment. But your client list includes executives at Manchester United, the banking industry, a range of individuals. There's documentary program making services, branched out into PR. But there's that thing that the one bit of advice that jumped out for me is that I'd say I'll always prefer radio, because you can do great radio in your pajamas. And indeed, I have done great radio in my pajamas. But in TV, the semiotics are that much more important. And the importance of slowing down a little bit when you're talking to camera compared to how you might do on a radio microphone is pretty important. And that's something, I learned it eventually, but when I first started in television, I didn't have that. But there's 5, I would say on the website, there's 5 very basic points that anyone can learn over time. Now, the screen happens to like some people a lot more than it likes others, but these are things, very basic advice people can learn for free on your website right now.
Yes, it's all there. And particularly now with all the Zoom meetings that people are doing, I'm suddenly helping people become better performance to camera on these virtual meetings, because people are terrified of the camera. They're terrified of so many things they're not used to. And people say to me, well, I hate what I look like and I hate what I sound like. And I have to say to them, well, in all honesty, that's how your clients see you and hear you anyway. What's going on in your head? But there are a number of do's and don'ts that you can just follow to help you be a better presenter on Zoom or any of the other, platforms there are now to do these meetings. Make sure you look at the camera. I mean, how many times on network television have we seen up people's noses and chins because they're simply not looking looking at the camera at the right level. Simple, basic stuff, but people don't understand it or don't get it. They don't realize it. So I'm working with a lot of people just explaining these basic things to do and how to become better at what they're doing, because people always say to me, oh, well, so-and-so, they've got the gift of the gab, or it's all right for them. But presentation skills or public speaking, call it what you will, it's not a gift, it's a skill. And like any skill, as you well know, Marcus, the more you do, the better you become. The more you practice, the easier it becomes, the better you are at it. So it's encouraging people to practice, watch what they do, listen to what they do, follow the do's and don'ts, and then they can improve and actually enjoy what they're doing on this, in these very strange times. We're all doing things we never used to do or couldn't imagine us doing. We're doing it on a regular basis. So if you follow the rules, follow the regulations, don't do anything silly, you'll be good at it.
And I would say, it does come with practice, whether it's radio or television, and be hard on yourself, but don't be too hard on yourself, because at the end of the day, everyone started somewhere. Nobody really likes looking back at their very early work, and it's all a little bit cringy when we think, oh, I wish I'd known then what I know now. And, I listen back to my early radio performances, I've become that much more comfortable in my own skin, so to speak. And I think there's an element of that with all of us. But you can improve everybody. And again, the habit in television, now obviously the money in television isn't what it used to be, and the shelf life of presenters and reporters isn't what it used to be. And I don't have to name names here by any means. I don't want to embarrass anyone in particular, but you put the television on sometimes and you think, this is a very attractive woman here, but is she here for her journalistic skills or her looks? Do you think the balance has tilted a little bit the wrong way?
Yes, I do. I don't. For me, it's the journalism that matters. Obviously, you have to look presentable. Don't get me wrong. And you dress for the part, don't you? Some of the reporting, some of the clothes I've seen reporters are wearing, I find ridiculous. You wouldn't go and see your mother-in-law on a Sunday afternoon wearing a jeans and a t-shirt. You just wouldn't do it. Or maybe you would. But you take my point. It's horses for courses. You should literally dress the part. And if somebody's good enough, then that's good enough for me. You shouldn't get the job because you're this or you're that, according to whatever is popular at the time. I think that's quite important, but the pendulum is swinging. The pendulum always swings. And at the moment, in my view, it's going in the wrong direction. And what I hate to see is affiliations. I mentioned earlier that when I was a full-time sports reporter, I would never let on that I was a Luton Town fan. And I used to get complaints from from Spurs or from Arsenal that I favoured the other team, so I thought I must be doing something right. But I would never let on personal politics or favours. And yet now I see presenters who are wearing badges, promoting this or promoting that. I mean, Hugh Edwards wouldn't say, "Welcome to News at 10, vote Labour," would he? I mean,
well, Hugh Edwards is an interesting case in point. I'm glad you mentioned Hugh Edwards. He wouldn't go on there and say vote Labour, but you look at him on social media, he seems to have been given a free pass to say what he likes in terms of Welsh language provision, because both his parents were senior figures in Plaid Cymru, and the way he attacked the Guardian columnist Zoe Williams earlier this year. And on issues related, because both his parents were senior Welsh nationalists, they would have known Saunders Lewis and Gwynfor Evans and people like that. Hugh Edwards has been given a bit of a free pass on the Welsh language, and no one at the BBC has stood up to him on that. And I also think Hugh Edwards, not just on the Welsh language, on other issues as well, but certain other BBC reporters, their behaviour on Twitter, I think, hang on, you're going dangerously close to the edge here in terms of impartiality. And I think back also to Emily Maitlis on Newsnight. And there's a woman who some of her dress sense has been a bit iffy over the years, shall we say, the way she's appeared on there. But do you remember it was a matter of weeks ago now, I think, when the height of the pandemic, when she was effectively given a 3-minute monologue to give us her take on it. And there's this crossover between facts and analysis, which is what I expect from an impartial news programme, to a sort of running commentary with somebody with a perspective and an agenda. And I think particularly when you're in a publicly funded organisation, that is very dangerous.
I couldn't agree with you more. And the BBC, I sometimes think, forgets what it's there to do. It wasn't her place to say that. It certainly wasn't the programme to say it in. And, to me, she should have been severely reprimanded, if not sacked. I mean, I don't understand what goes on I sound like Fred Truman on Test Match Special, don't I? I can't understand what's going on out there. But it is quite odd nowadays, all driven by social media, of course. But to me, social media is great. It's important. And it's only going to get bigger. But there are restrictions, and you just can't say, in my book, some of the things that these reporters and others are saying. It's not the place for them to do it. They really should be impartial, as I was talking about earlier, in terms of their own preferences. They shouldn't be allowed to do it, and they shouldn't really want to do it, because in my view it affects their impartiality. And if people don't respect their impartiality and believe they're reporting from an agenda, then we've got problems. And that seems to be growing now, doesn't it, amongst so many people. They believe so-and-so has an agenda, the BBC has an agenda, this, that and the other. And the BBC are just piling in. I mean, I think they're making tremendous mistakes. They're spending £6 million on diversity now, where if you look at the figures, the BBC are actually doing quite well. I was reading a report the other day which suggested 52% of on-screen staff is female. Their BAME representation is way above what the proportion is in the country. So they're actually ticking all the right boxes. They're doing a very good job, and good luck to them, and absolutely correctly. They're working in an absolutely right way, but then they're spending £6 million on more diversity, while we've got the issue with the licenses for the over 75, which comes in just a couple of weeks' time. I just think they've got some of these big decisions wrong, in my humble opinion.
Well, I think you're absolutely spot on, because I think this is diversity disappearing up its own backside in many ways, what you're seeing at the BBC at the moment. And Andrew Marr, he gave a lecture, 14 years ago, and I haven't got the exact quote in front of me, but he said, the BBC is essentially a goldfish bowl. A lot of the staff are cut from the same cloth. It's not so much a party political bias, but it's a culturally liberal bias. It's very urban. It doesn't have much understanding of rural issues. And it's all very much the sort of London elitist outlook. And there is a disconnect between the BBC and the audience it serves, I think. And people people can see through all this diversity agenda here. It shouldn't be a box ticking exercise. True diversity is the best people in the best jobs on merit. That's what diversity should ideally mean in the real world. And sadly, it doesn't mean that. And I'm not saying it's a perfect situation by any means, but the BBC is going to absurd lengths with this diversity and political correctness agenda. Did you see that video a few weeks ago? The BBC Sounds put up, how can white women stop being Karens? Did you see that? Now, to me, how on earth did that ever get on that website at all? No one at the BBC, I'd say for a minute, hold on, this is ridiculous. This is absurd. It's offensive to people called Karen, for a start. And there are many thousands of people called Karen in this country. And it's just nonsense. It's what was it? Amelia and Lottie, I think the two women were called in that video. And they was, how can white being stop being Karens? Have they got any idea just how stupid this sounds to the vast majority of people out there in the real world? And that sort of thing bothers me. But going back to what you were saying about Emily Maitlis, I think she crossed another line about a year ago when James O'Brien, the LBC presenter, who I put it politely, have had my differences with, she wrote the foreword to his book, How to Be Right. Now, James O'Brien has a very specific worldview, if you like. He is the sort of Islington man, hipster, middle-class Remainer. That's his worldview. And you listen to LBC at 10 o'clock in the morning, you know that's what you're going to get. But for Emily Maitlis to write the foreword and to say what a wonderful book it was, and I think I might be right in saying he returned the favour when she published her book. I might be right about that. But I think a dangerous line was crossed there, because James O'Brien is a partisan person. Indeed, he was removed from Newsnight as a cover presenter because he's partisan. I think Emily Maitlis crossed a dangerous line there.
Yes, I agree with you. We're agreeing with each other here this afternoon. But things have changed swiftly, in front of our very eyes. I mean, when I was doing sport for ITV, for example, I could never work for the BBC. It was just, you wouldn't do that. Nowadays, you've got presenters that crisscross with BT Sport and others. And the whole point was, if people switched on and saw you on there, they'd know what they were watching. They were watching HTV Cardiff or something. But nowadays, you see familiar faces popping up all over the place, and you don't know what you're watching. And the rule book has been torn up, and there is no rule book anymore. And I think that goes very much towards what you were just saying. And I think it's a detrimental move. I think it's bad policy. And I think program output suffers, and I think the audience suffers too, because of all this interchanging and lack of respect for for the audience, really, because I don't care what Emily Maitlis thinks about this, that, or the other. I don't think that's her job. Her job is to be the conduit to get the information out from the people she's interviewing. I really have no interest in her personal politics whatsoever, and I think that should be the main criteria. But call me old-fashioned. You're old-fashioned.
There was a very good piece in the Times the other day by Roger Mosey, the former senior figure at BBC Sport, who's now an academic. And he said the BBC has got to make a decision. Is it going to commit itself to impartial journalism and being even-handed, or does it see itself in this sort of campaigning role with journalists pursuing an agenda? And obviously, well, the answer for you and I mean, I'm 36, but I've got old-fashioned values, I suppose, is that they should absolutely be impartial because it's publicly funded by pain of imprisonment if you want to watch television and don't pay for a license fee. So they have a duty to be impartial. But we have seen them drift over into this sort of left-leaning campaigning journalism with their endorsement of, well, various causes, like the whole Black Lives Matter thing. Now, you'll know through speaking to Jeremy Jacobs, and my friend Johnny Gould has been very big on this, saying, well, actually, the Black Lives Matter charity has, and it says this on its own website, has quite a pseudo-Marxist agenda, if you like, to abolish the police. It's very anti-Israel. This is not something the BBC should be actively endorsing. Now, say no to racism, or the long-standing Kick It Out campaign against racism in football, yes, all right-thinking people would agree that racism has no place in football. But Black Lives Matter is a charity with a political agenda. They won't even tell us who their directors are. This is not something that media organisations should be actively endorsing, in my view.
I agree with you again. For example, Black Lives Matter, of course they do it. Everybody would stick up for that. But their politics is, well, I don't agree with the politics of Black Lives Matter at all. Getting rid of capitalism, defunding the police, boycott Israel. I mean, what's it got to do with Black Lives Matter? I think it's grim. And the way we see them taking the knee at football matches, and I was always under the impression that footballers would be booked if they showed a political statement on their vest under their shirt, and then suddenly they're running around with Black Lives Matter on their shirts. I don't see how that's compatible. And I remember a few years ago, Moeen Ali was fined and banned for wearing a wristband which had a political statement on it. And now the cricketers are running around with Black Lives Matter. I mean, nobody objects to Black Lives Matter, but I just think it's the wrong use of the slogan, bearing in mind the political consequences. Can you split them? Can you split the message from the politics? Well, personally, I don't think so. Perhaps others do. But if you look at Sky Sports News now, everywhere you look, it's Black Lives Matter and this, that, and the other. Absolutely right. But are they overlooking the political consequences of the movement?
Well, here's the way I see it, Graham. Black lives do matter, but with a small b, a small l, and a small m. Black Lives Matter, but I don't endorse the charity, which is why I use the small letters. Now, if I was thinking about this watching football over a matter of weeks, if I was presenting the coverage on Sky, I wouldn't want the Black Lives Matter logo on my shirt for the reasons you and I have already said. I would be more than willing to wear a Kick It Out badge because I detest and abhor racism with every bone in my body. So I would wear that. But again, I was watching even the World Match Play Darts, which is taking place this week. Now, Nigel Pearson has just taken over from Dave Clark as the main presenter of Sky's darts coverage. Even on his shirt, he had the Black Lives Matter logo. I would point blank to refuse to wear that. Now, would that have consequences for my career if I was in that position? I suspect it probably would. But you just imagine, Graham, if you were the one footballer playing in the Premier League or the Championship who said, you know what, I don't endorse this anarchist agenda, defund the police and anti-Israel and everything else. I don't endorse that. And therefore, I won't be taking a knee because it's sort of compulsory and I won't be getting involved in this. I'll wear the Kick It Out badge like I wear once a year anyway, and it's been around for 25 years. You imagine how that footballer would be treated if he stood up straight while others were taking the knee. Would he be forced out the club? Would he be hounded on social media? Would there be calls for him to be sacked and never employed by a football club ever again, as though he committed a serious criminal offence? I think in this day and age, they probably would.
Yes, they probably would. And it is now a Sky directive. If you appear front of camera You are not allowed to wear a tie. That's out. You can't wear a tie. You must look casual, and you have to wear these slogans and logos at the moment. It's a directive, and if you don't like to do it, then you won't get on air. It's as straightforward as that. So I've heard from colleagues and others, and I think that's not right. I think it's a mistake. I think they'll come to regret it. But that's the policy they're covering at the moment. I mean, there have been footballers down the years. I'm trying to think of the name of the Irish player who always objects to the anthem. I can't remember his
it's
name.
not Stephen Ireland. It's the other one at Manchester City, isn't it? The one. That, I know.
Senior moment. I can't remember his name.
Yeah, I'm having one as well. Yeah.
So you are sort of stuck out on a limb if you don't conform, but. It's good that some of the independent presenters...
James McLean, isn't it? James McLean?
That's the one. Yeah, that's the one. Well done. Well remembered. People like Matt Letizia, he's refused to wear the badge and so on, which, good for him. He's sticking up for his rights. But he hasn't got to worry about his future so much. He's only a sort of Saturday afternoon freelance presenter, so it's not as important to him as perhaps others. But it's very difficult, especially if you're up and coming and you're told to wear something or not wear something. Then you have to go along with it if you want to do the job. In my view, as in your view, I think it's a mistake, but that's where we are at the moment, and it's disappointing, put it that way.
I find it extremely worrying that there's this sort of compulsory nature of it. That's what really concerns me about it, because I would point blank refuse to wear the Black Lives Matter logo on my clothing if I was on television, and I would face the consequences for that because I feel very strongly about it. But when things become compulsory in this way, they lose meaning anyway, because people are wearing it out of fear and taking the knee out of fear rather than because they actually want to. So that kind of waters down the purpose of it anyway. Final question for you then. Advice for newcomers, those breaking into the industry now. Now, as we have demonstrated, particularly in the early part of our discussion, local radio, whether it's BBC local radio or local commercial radio in particular, has changed to such an extent. Local commercial radio no longer does sport for the most part. There's very, very few examples left, particularly with the Bauer buying out various like Swansea Sound, where I appeared until very recently. They've now got rid of sport. I expect Signal in Stoke is one of the last ones. They're going to get rid of sport soon as well, I gather. There are very few local commercial stations still doing sport. It's gradually been in decline for about 20 years now, but we are where we are. BBC local radio, we've heard all the reports in recent weeks about the cutbacks there. If you're on a double-header breakfast programme, you're going to be cut back to one presenter. For people coming through now wanting to learn a trade, whether it's in news or whether it's in sports commentary, yes, there are all sorts of academic courses you can go on, and I'm sure you can give them good training through your company if they want it. But actually getting the breakthroughs, okay, there are opportunities to work behind the scenes on Sky Sports News if you want to go down that road in a BT Sport, particularly if you are able to live and work in London. And for a lot of people, that's out of reach because it's simply unaffordable. What advice would you be giving to young people today looking to break through?
Well, I'm occasional guest lecturer at the local university here, the University of Bedfordshire, and they have a massive media department with state-of-the-art kit. And it worries me and it frightens me. They have so many graduates each year, and I worry what kind of jobs they will get into, because, as you say, the opportunities are receding. And they write to me and they contact me and they say, have I got any work for them? Well, the way my business works is I don't have the opportunity to train people up. I need people who are ready to go, oven ready, as our Prime Minister would say. But one of the things I say to them in return, well, what have you done during your university days? Or what have you done since you left school? Have you started a regular blog? Have you started a podcast like this? Have you done some video work that is very easy to do now online? And most of them say, well, no, not really. And that to me is a wasted opportunity, because although the number of jobs is receding, the opportunities to get you out there is so much more nowadays, and so much easier to actually get yourself a following. If you do it well and you speak from the heart, whatever it happens to be, if you do it well, you will get a following, you will become a name in certain areas, and that will help you find the kind of niche that you're looking for. And everybody is trying to search for this niche. So I would encourage people not to go for the traditional jobs because there are so few, but to actually start today, this moment, regularly blogging, getting to a podcast, interviewing people in and around wherever you are. What do they do? So you get some experience, get some techniques, you get some exposure in that way, and stick it online and just keep working at it that way. And I think in time, if you have that commitment, because whatever era you come from, whatever age you come from, if you have that determination, if you have that drive, if you have that skin like a rhino, you will eventually get where you want to go. And that's a bit of a cliche, but in my view, it's true. I look back on the various people I've been working with in and around for all these years, and we all have a very similar determination to get there despite the setbacks. And believe you me, there are so many setbacks. There are so many people who say no, and you've got to overcome that. You've just got to have that ambition, keep going, find the confidence to keep it up, and you'll get there. But there's so many chances now to do what certainly possibly you couldn't do. So I certainly couldn't do in my youth, in my younger days, because the infrastructure wasn't there. So there's no excuse. If they want to do it, there is a means, there is a way, and they'll get there if they really push for it.
Well, I think what you're saying is absolutely correct. You've got to help yourself a little bit. I mean, even when I was at university, my final year, 2004, 2005, I was head of news at my student radio station. And not only was that news, that was sport as well. And I had a half-hour program me and my team would put together each evening, plus a recorded bulletin in the mornings. I built that up from there, and then I handed over to my successor after a year when I graduated. And it ran for a few more years after that, and then the station went bust. But that was nothing to do with me. I was long gone by then. But so... learn while you're studying, I would say, and also be quite light-footed. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Have a number of different things on the go at any one time. And I think, okay, local newspapers are in decline, quite severely in decline, and perhaps that's not the best route to go down these days in terms of the way so many local newspaper offices now. We just had a round of redundancies announced from Reach PLC, who own a very large number of newspapers, and NewsQuest as well have announced redundancies recently. So perhaps local newspapers aren't the best route to go down these days. But I say to people, look, take, for example, the former head of news at TVS in the South Coast, a guy called David Morris-Jones, who's now living about 1.5 miles away from me in Penarth, in the town of Penarth in South Wales. He has set up the best hyperlocal news site I've ever seen. And David, to this day, I was talking to his daughter about this a while ago, actually, his work ethic is absolutely tremendous. He puts about 4 articles on there per day, about 250 words each. And his news site gets more hits than the local paper's site because people trust it as a local news source. Now, there's a certain level of commitment there. David knows every contact going. And I don't think he really does retirement, David. He turned 80 a few months ago. He had a period of illness last year, but he's well and truly bounced back. And that is an example. I would say anyone who wants to set up a hyperlocal news site, look at what David Morris-Jones does in the Penarth News. He's been a journalist since the 1960s, first at BBC Wales, then at TVS, then he moved back to Wales again after TVS lost the South Coast franchise. And in retirement, so-called retirement, this is what he's doing. So any student wanting to break into journalism, I'd recommend that as a route to go down. Model yourself on David Morris-Jones, set up a hyperlocal blog. Work experience is important in terms of making contacts and gaining a reputation for being reliable and hardworking, even if you're not the finished article yourself. And be light-footed, except that you'll have to put your eggs in a few different baskets. I mean, a typical week for me, I've been working for Clive Everton at Snooker Scene for 9 years. I do work for Talk Sport Radio. I work for Private Eye magazine. I'm a political analyst at Radio Sputnik. And I do bits and pieces for others as well. So that's quite a diverse portfolio in that I somehow managed to carve a career in both politics and sport. I don't think that would have been possible in previous eras, but it seems to work for me at the moment. And having this diverse portfolio, and also be prepared to span out into PR and do the sort of work you're doing, Graham. And I would say to people who want to make it in journalism, yes, it is still possible. The money is not what it used to be. And you do have to be sort of quite light-footed in the sense that jobs appear and disappear very quickly.
Yes, money shouldn't be the driving factor. It's obviously important, of course it is, but it's that drive, it's that demand, it's that desire to let people know what's going on, your inquisitiveness, what actually is happening here. Pull people to account. Do you mean that? Why are you saying that? Asking those questions, getting the information, getting it out there. It's a thrill. It's a thrill when you have a story that nobody else has and you're able to tell the world or even a small part of the world all about it. It's a great thrill. That's what journalism is all about. I still find it fascinating. I still find it enthralling and inspiring. And don't go for the money. Everybody, a number of people who speak to me from the university, they want to be sports reporters. They want to get in front of camera. They want to be Chris Kamara or whatever. You can only be yourself, and you've an important part to play as yourself because there's nobody else quite like you. So don't try and be anybody you're not. And there are opportunities, as we've both been saying, and people have to be realistic. be as light-footed as you put it is a very good way of saying it. Be interested in everything. I mean, I didn't set out to be a sports reporter. I just happened to love sport, and it worked out that in most newsrooms I worked at, I was the only one who did like sports. So I got to cover the sports stories anyway. But news is the thing, once you've learned the basics of news reporting, you can then pretty much move on to anything and just learn the basics, like building a house. If you build a house without a foundation, guess what? It'll fall down. Learn the basics, learn the trade, and then it gives you a very good start to move into whatever niche or area that really interests you.
And I think the only one other piece of advice, everything you've said there is spot on. The one other piece of advice, it's perhaps not quite as easy to do this as it used to be, but if you are in a workplace, if you've got a sort of tough cookie boss, and I'm not saying not a bully, I've got no time for bullies, but somebody will firmly tell you, no, you've got this wrong, you need to learn this, that, and the other, get you into good habits when you're still starting out, and that will stay with you for the rest of your career. And for me, it was a certain individual who was very sort of check, and check again, leave absolutely nothing to chance, make sure that every bit of information you either write or broadcast is spot on. And I think that fact-checking is so important.
Absolutely. I had the news editor of my program at HTV West was a guy called Ron Evans, absolute genius. And he instilled in me some almost motivations and ideas that I still think about when I'm covering a story. I say, well, how would Ron deal with this? What would he say to me? After all these years, he's still there at the back of my mind talking to me. And you're quite right. I mean, these are the foundations, the roots that never change. Whatever area you are in, these basics will always remain the same, and follow those, and you'll be able to get the story. Who, what, why, when, and where. It's so simple, but so many people don't do it. Just read the books on it. There's loads of books on it, but perhaps most importantly of all, watch and listen, and you can see for yourself what works and what doesn't. And well, I wouldn't do it that way. I'd do it this way. So ask yourself, well, why would I do it this way? Would it benefit me or the viewer in a particular way? So constantly question. Don't watch television or listen to the radio or read online or read the newspapers as an ordinary punter. Read it as a professional. Question it, query it, ask questions about it in your head or to others, and really analyze what's going on here to get the best out of it. You're no longer a punter. If this is the profession you want to get in, you're not a punter. You are one of the team. So you've got to learn how it's done and why. And you can question that all the time. I continue to make mistakes. I continue to try and not make them again. That's the way it is. Nothing is perfect. You've got to keep going and keep trying the best and get it as right as you possibly can, following the rules. Social media at the moment, sadly, doesn't follow the rules, doesn't follow the legal requirements that traditional broadcasters have, which in my view it will do in time to come. At the moment, it's like the Wild West. It will have to in time to come. But those are the basics you have to know about. The libel laws, this, that, and the other.
The laws of libel and defamation. I think a lot of people who use social media need to realise that actually the same laws apply to you as apply to everybody else. And I see defamatory comments about any topic under the sun on social media, and I think the time will come where Twitter in particular has to say, look, we have to have your real name and a profile picture and some verifiable information for contact here, because it's just completely out of control now, isn't it?
I agree. As I say, these are the Wild West days. It will sort itself out in time because of what's happening. We won't stand for it for very much longer, but it isn't going away. It will become far more far more controlled for the right reasons. And you're quite right. They have to follow the same rules as the newspapers and other publications. They have to, and they will do in time. I mean, why the authorities don't come down on some of these platforms like a ton of bricks, I really don't know. They say they're not broadcasters. They say they're not publishers, but they are. It's as simple as that. That's exactly what they are.
Yeah, and they've lost control of their own platform. In the moderation on Twitter, you can report a tweet for unsuitable content or libel or whatever, and you've sort of got this sort of kangaroo court somewhere in Silicon Valley in California or whatever, who decides what stays and what goes, and that can't be right, can it?
No, it can't be. And some of the things that come down, they've made good decisions, but then we all know some of the footage on YouTube and elsewhere is appalling, and it's still there. That needs to be addressed.
It does. Well, Graham, you've been a fascinating guest, and if people are interested in working with you, what's the easiest way to contact you?
Well, go on the website, which is media-vu, media-vu.co.uk, and all the details are on there. My Twitter is @mevu, @mevu. And all my phone numbers are there. I'm very old-fashioned. Do you know what? I answer the phone. How about that? So,
a rare commodity these days, Graham. But
you retro communication. Pick up the phone.
It feels like that, doesn't it? Well, Graham, you've been a great guest. Thank you so much for your time. I hope people have found it interesting and useful. It's been terrific to hear your voice again. And let's catch up again sometime soon.
You're very kind. I've enjoyed it too. Thank you very much, Marcus.
Graham Miller there. Thank you for listening. Join us again next time.